The continent of Africa is being unified economically and politically under an EU-style continental regime beyond the reach of citizens. Known formally as the African Union, the plot to smash national sovereignty and what little self-government exists on the continent has been in full swing in recent years. And the entire integration agenda is, in fact, being supported and financed by the Obama administration, the European Union, and the communist dictatorship ruling mainland China. None of those powers have the interests of Africans in mind. Similar regionalization plots are underway across Latin America, Eurasia, Europe, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and North America. The most advanced is the EU, which is an outgrowth of what was supposed to be a common market. Another example is NAFTA, which is intended to follow the common market EU trajectory. All of the regional union regimes are being created by and for the benefit of globalists who claim they are working for free trade while building their transnational bureaucracies. And ultimately, the endgame involves bringing all of the regions into a single global system, as globalists have made perfectly clear. In Africa's developments, there are many lessons to learn for those who wish to understand the New World Order being imposed on humanity, and the deceptive process through which it is occurring. The road to a regional regime ruling over Africa has begun much as it did in Europe by using deception to erect transnational governmental institutions under the phony guise of peace, free trade, and prosperity. The New American documented this scheming, and the players involved, in an in-depth August 20, 2013 article headlined, "The EU, Regionalization Trumps Sovereignty." Interestingly, though, what is happening in Africa, different in some ways than the European project, provides insight into, among other schemes, how the various regions of the world will be subsumed under an even more powerful outfit on top. In Africa, owing to a lack of infrastructure and communications, unifying the entire continent all at once is simply not practical. So, globalist planners both from the West and from the East are making use of sub-regional governments that will eventually all be merged under the emerging single African regime. A perfect illustration of this phenomena can be found in an examination of the emerging tripartite free trade area. The NAFTA regime, as it is being dubbed, aims to integrate three African regional economic communities, RECs, into a free trade area stretching from Cape Town, South Africa, to Cairo, Egypt. The bloc will include the sub-regional regimes known as the Southern African Development Community, SADC, the East African Community, AC, and the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMSA. Once completed, the project aims to effectively abolish national borders, putting some 600 million people and over $1 trillion worth of economic activity under the rule of supranational institutions, as we shall show. Eventually, Africa's other sub-regional regimes, at least 5 more, are recognized by the African Union, which is fully behind the NAFTA, are also expected to join in, thereby unifying the continent under a single mechanism for autocratic economic governance. To help bring about this continental union, in early September the United Nations even launched training for African officials on how to negotiate and implement the trade regime being designed for them by globalist powerhouses in Europe, North America, and Asia. Globalists celebrated the possibilities. The scheme will demand real political will from regional and national policymakers, explained so Andrea Manenjara at George Washington University in a piece for the left-leaning Brookings Institution, a globalist think tank. But it will not stop there. Indeed, the deal is expected to be the launching pad for the establishment of the even more ambitious continental free trade area that is expected to cover all of Africa, Andrea Manenjara added. In the process, the launch has demonstrated the possibility of collective action among 26 very heterogeneous nations, For example, with GDP per capita ranging from the Seychelles almost $16,000 to Burundi's $270, and shows the feasibility of harmonizing three very different preferential trade regimes into one unified scheme. The bigger picture. That, in essence, is what globalist forces eventually hope to do to the entire world. Once national governments worldwide finish surrendering their sovereignty to regional regimes, the EU, Vladimir Putin's Eurasian Union, the Union of South American States, UNASA or UNASUL, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, the Middle East Union, and more, all of the regional blocs will be subsumed under a single global authority. None of this is a secret, and those involved in HTE agenda have openly boasted of their machinations. The contemporary quest for world order, world government, will require a coherent strategy to establish a concept of order, regional government, within the various regions and to relate these regional orders, governments, to one another, explains senior globalist Henry Kissinger in his latest book, World Order. Of course, in Africa, that process is simpler in many ways than in regions such as Europe. That is because most of the so-called nations of Africa today are artificial anyway. The borders were largely drawn arbitrarily by European powers with no regard for the pre-existing tribes, people groups, and nations that already existed on the continent. Just the nation of Nigeria, for example, contains more than 250 distinct ethnic tribes, many of which were warring with each other long before Europeans arrived and created Nigeria. As such, Africans, at least generally speaking, have little loyalty to the concept of nationhood as defined for them by Europeans, so the idea of losing an abstract concept such as national sovereignty means little. Self-government, meanwhile, has been a rarity across most of Africa for centuries, outside of perhaps tribal governance structures. So what kind of union are Africa's globalist-backed leaders imposing on the peoples of Africa? A brief look at the OA's history provides some clues, as does a look at its leadership and the forces behind the project. First, the history. The first attempt at creating a single political regime to rule over Africa was hatched in Europe by colonial powers. Due to rivalry for colonies by major European powers, each of which wanted colonies, the efforts failed. Later, various attempts were made in the form of, among others, the Soviet-backed Union of African States, the Organization of African Unity, OAU, and finally, in 1981, the emergence of the African Economic Community, similar in purpose to the European Economic Community that was used to trick Europeans into surrendering their own national sovereignty under the guise of trade. By 1999, brutal Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi convened his fellow African rulers in Cirta to officially replace the OAU with the African Union. The OAU was formally born in 2002. An open secret. Today, globalist and communist forces and their African puppet regimes hardly bother to conceal the ultimate agenda or its totalitarian nature. Consider the OAU's current leadership. The chairperson of the OAU Commission, for example, is Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, the ex-wife of South Africa's polygamist totalitarian ruler Jacob Zuma and a key leader within the Marxist-Leninist African National Congress, ANC, that rules South Africa in an alliance with the Communist Party. Most recently, under her leadership, the ANC's international relations team celebrated the post-Western New World Order, along with the exemplary role of the collective leadership of the Communist Party of China. The brutal mass-murdering regime in Beijing should be a guiding lodestar of our own struggle, Dlamini-Zuma's team said in a recently released official ANC policy document. In 2012, speaking at the Socialist International Congress, she said the United Nations was the greatest collective achievement of humankind. Also leading the OAU today is ruthless Marxist dictator Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, among the most brutal tyrants on the planet and a continent packed with despots. The genocidal tyrant, brought to power with help from U.S. President Jimmy Carter and the regime enslaving North Korea, among others, was selected by his comrades ruling Africa to serve as chairman of the broader O for 2015. While much of the world was horrified by the news, fellow African rulers and even United Nations boss Ban Ki-moon were celebrating the power transfer in Ethiopia's Addis Ababa. The Zimbabwean tyrant said climate change, development, attacking Israel, terrorism, gender equality, and more will be among his top priorities as chief of the continental regime. The former terrorist even touted his ethnic cleansing and thievery masquerading as land reform as a model for Africa and the O under his leadership. Previous O chairs have included Gaddafi, along with numerous other communist and Islamist tyrants. A look at the forces backing and financing the imposition of an unaccountable, unelected continental regime on Africans also reveals a great deal. Consider, for example, that the murderous regime in Beijing financed the entire construction of the O's headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Perhaps by mere appropriate coincidence, the $200 million building was built on the site of a former maximum security prison. In 2012, the communist Chinese regime pledged $100 million in funding through 2015 to the O, a massive sum amounting to almost 10% of the entire NAFTA regime's GDP and more than a third of the O's annual budget. The people of China and Africa are good friends, good partners and good brothers, senior communist Chinese official Jia Qinglin told African leaders while announcing the lavish funding for African integration. Our friendship is as solid as the towering Mount Kilimanjaro and as vibrant as the Yangtze River and the Yellow River. Beijing still provides much of the O's funding. But contrary to the bogus narrative peddled in the establishment press suggesting that communist China and the West are competing over resources in Africa, in reality, Western globalists and Chinese communists are pursuing precisely the same agenda, forcing all Africans to live under a globalist-controlled continental regime. Just this summer, Obama was in Africa celebrating the O and giving a keynote speech in its communist Chinese-built headquarters in a hall named after Soviet-backed Communist Party and Ang leader Nelson Mandela. The choices made today will shape the trajectory of Africa for decades to come, Obama said. As you build the Africa you believe in, you will have no better partner and friend than the United States of America. He who pays the piper calls the tune. Leaders such as Dlamini Zuma, whose Zhang international team recently blasted US-led Western imperialism against progressive governments such as the socialist regime enslaving Venezuela, said in a statement that Obama's visit was another concrete step to broaden and deepen the relationship between the O and the US. Obama is also using U.S. taxpayer resources for everything from drastically boosting the O's military forces to foisting green and pro-homosexuality policies on the continent. The EU, itself a secret project of globalists in the United States and Europe, is also providing lavish funding for the O under various schemes. Just one of them, the Africa-EU Partnership, with its slogan "Two Unions, One Vision," provides hundreds of millions of dollars in funding from European taxpayers to finance the imposition of the O on Africans. The EU is also supporting the tripartite (TIFTA) integration process by providing funding through the 10th European Development Fund for the negotiations and for the Project Preparation and Implementation Unit, a briefing document by the EU's pseudo-parliament explained. In fact, the EU boasts that the O is mostly funded by European taxpayers, notwithstanding the heavy funding the O receives from Beijing. The European Union collectively, EU and member states, is the biggest contributor to the O Commission, supporting more than 80% of its program budget, the EU Commission boasted in an April 2015 press release. The EU has been supporting continental integration efforts in Africa over the years. This includes an allocation of $1.6 billion for the African Peace Facility, which is the main source that funds African peace and security efforts. The EU Commission's Pan-African Instrument in 2014, meanwhile, will provide more than a $1 billion to fund integration, abolishing African borders, climate alarmism, and more. Putting together the puzzle. Where is it all going? Speaking in 2012 at the annual World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, for globalist billionaires, South African President Zuma, who regularly sings songs advocating genocide of the European descent minority, demanded, among other schemes, that people be allowed to move freely across borders in Africa. Other totalitarian-minded rulers echoed the globalist rhetoric, and noted that the dictatorship in China was already helping. Ethiopian Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, for example, echoed calls by another African ruler for creating Pan-African government ministries and noted that some continental policy was already being handled by agencies. Capacity building is already happening across Africa, with many partners involved, including India and China, he said. However, he also warned that we cannot wish a common African government into existence, and that the integration process for getting that common African government would not be fast or easy. Today, the O-Today is openly working toward the creation of a single fiat currency run by a single European central bank-style African central bank. Several regional currencies already exist among the myriad sub-regional regimes on the continent. But eventually, perhaps as soon as a decade from now if current timelines hold, those will be replaced with the African single currency issued by the African Central Bank. The self-styled Pan-African Parliament held its first session in 2004 and is set to receive full legislative powers in the not-too-distant future. A widely ridiculed Continental Court of Justice also exists already. The O even now has military forces under its command, generally deployed on UN-backed peacekeeping missions across the continent plagued by scandal, rape and murder. Similar to the various economic master plans of communist dictatorships, the O also has its Agenda 2063 framework and the 10-year implementation plan supposedly aimed at bringing about Africa's vision for prosperity, integration, and peace. In reality, it will bring continental tyranny. Despite the altruistic-sounding platitudes, the globalist and communist forces behind the O do not have Africans' well-being in mind, any more than the forces behind the EU had Europeans' interests in mind when deceiving them into surrendering their national sovereignty and right to self-government to unaccountable transnational institutions. Actions by the EU, the UN, and the World Bank in Africa make it abundantly clear, such as brutally uprooting villages and tribes to make way for trees to profit off, carbon credits, UN peace forces raping children and slaughtering protesters, backing jihadists in Libya who went on to ethnically cleanse blacks from the nation, imposing strict population control regimes, lacing UN vaccines with sterilizing agents, etc. The result in Africa will be the same as what is now happening in Europe, too: centralization of power, loss of freedom, social engineering, and rule by bureaucratic decree. The exact same process is being used around the world in every region on the planet. And the ultimate goal has nothing to do with peace, security, or prosperity, as proponents falsely argue in their slick marketing materials. Instead, the goal is regional government leading to world government. Africans, Europeans, Americans, and people around the world would be wise to realize what is taking place and put a stop to it. The alternative, the much-hyped New World Order, will be a nightmare for all but those at the very top.